And one day out from the local elections, Keir Starmer is the latest Labour leader accused of failing to take action against anti-Semites and Putin apologists in the party. Nearly a dozen MPs, including Diane Abbott and John McDonnell, signed a Stop the War coalition statement critical of NATO at the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine before later withdrawing their names. Meanwhile, local Labour councillors on the election trail this week reported they were still feeling the anger from voters for vile anti-Semitism that ran rife through the party while Jeremy Corbyn was leader. Now, Starmer has promised to rid Labour of the anti-NATO and anti-Semites.
Well, I think I've been very clear on both anti-Semitism and on our unshakable support for NATO, and calling out this false equivalence between Russian aggression, and it is Russian aggression in Ukraine, and the acts of NATO. These are principles that are absolutely the root of the Labour Party, centre of the Labour Party, and I'm determined that the Labour Party will face the electorate and not the sort of internal machinations and arguments that we have had too much of in the past.
But does one of the most spineless men in Westminster have the muscle to deliver on his pledge, and is purging the party of the hard left the only way he can be taken seriously? I want to know your thoughts on this. Dan at gbnews.uk. Tweet me at gbnews. We've got our poll running there too. But doing battle on this tonight, former Conservative Minister Edwina Currie and Ken Livingstone, the former Labour Mayor of London. Edwina Currie, Starmer seems to have a lot of rhetoric around this issue, but he hasn't really done anything, has he?
Well, Keir Starmer seems to be moderately good at making speeches and pretty hopeless at actually putting them into action. I mean, that's understandable because he's not Prime Minister and doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons. But when it comes to ruling the Labour Party and setting the tone for what the Labour Party stands for and how it is seen, then he does have a lot of responsibility. And it seems to me that in shifting the debate and the argument to NATO and attitudes to NATO, I think he's shifting the goalposts. He hasn't yet sorted out the issue of anti-Semitism in his party. He hasn't yet, I think, sorted through all the candidates and the councillors, including sitting councillors, some of whom will be standing in the next general election, who got very tainted indeed in the last general election by associating themselves with anti-Semitic remarks and tweets and tropes and memes and all the rest of it. And he hasn't done that. He promised he would, but he hasn't done it. He's still not resolved these issues, in my view.
Ken Livingstone, obviously you're one of the people who was purged from the party, you might say, but you don't think the hard left should be cleared out of Labour?
Well, I think the simple fact is that this has been ramped up because they fear the election of a Labour government. And I've been in the Labour Party. I joined the Labour Party back in 1969. In all that time, I've never heard anyone make an anti-Semitic comment. And literally, the week I was suspended, 80 Jewish Labour Party members published a letter in The Guardian saying in all their hundreds of years in the party, they'd never heard or seen anything anti-Semitic. Because if you're anti-Semitic, you're not going to join the Labour Party. But for a century, the Labour Party was the political homeland for Britain's Jewish community.
But it
isn't anymore.
The evidence.
And it certainly wasn't when you were in it, Ken. You ended up having a stand-up row with John Mann in the BBC, actually on the steps. You made some of your own colleagues so furious that they couldn't wait to see you out. And you and people like you hounded out some of the most venerable and veteran Jewish MPs like Louise Ellman. We saw people like Luciana Berger being barracked when they came to a conference. It was awful, absolutely awful what was happening. And I didn't hear a word of condemnation from you. I heard you say what you said at the very beginning of your remarks, which is, it was all exaggerated. No, it wasn't all exaggerated. It was a serious, serious problem, and it has not yet been resolved, despite the fact that you and people like you have been thrown out of the party.
Look, literally, I was asked a question on a radio programme, is what Hitler did illegal? And, of course, murdering 6 million Jews is the greatest crime in human history. And I refer to the fact that in the 1930s, he'd actually done a deal with the German Zionists, not because they liked each other, and that deal was that they would migrate Germany's Jews to the then British colony of Palestine, and 60,000 German Jews were moved in that 6 years running up to the war. And if that hadn't happened, those 60,000 would have followed the 6 million into the gas chamber. That's why that deal was done. The simple fact is that the Nazi murder of 6 million Jews, greatest crime in human history. And for people now to sort of undermine this, trying to use this in current British politics, to distract attention from the fact that Keir Starmer, I joined the Labour Party over 50 years ago. I've never known us to have such an honest and competent leader in all my time. And I think he will be the greatest Prime Minister since Clement Attlee back in the late 1940s.
Edwina?
Well, don't believe me. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission reported that on at least 3 occasions, Labour had actually broken the law on anti-Semitism. And they themselves, were deeply criticised, widely criticised by some aspects of the Labour Party for being so bold as to say, the Labour Party as it stood, I think that was October 2020. So it's that recently that the Labour Party was being told very firmly it really had to get its act together. There's a reason why, Dan. There's a reason why this stance has been taken by Labour in recent years. And that is that somebody, and it could well have been Ken himself, did a calculation that we have something like 5 million Muslims in Britain and only about 250,000 practicing Jews. And that therefore perhaps the Muslim vote was more valuable than the Jewish vote.
And how do you respond to that?
Report was dishonest. The Commission's report wasn't true, and I am suing them, and I'm taking an action in court along with other people because that was a dishonest.
Okay, but Ken, that's the anti-Semitism issue. Fine, we'll park that. When it comes to NATO membership, you yourself, you were the co-chairman of Labour's Defence Review in 2016, where you said it did not even matter whether the UK was in NATO as the Cold War was over. Well, that position is now provably untrue after this invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
Well, the simple fact is that with the end of the Cold War, it was madness to carry on having NATO. Clearly now we have a very dangerous Russian leader. Putin is a war criminal, and therefore we most likely do have to make sure we've got a military alliance in Western Europe to protect us from further
But Diane
invasion.
Abbott and John McDonnell, 2 of your allies, signed the Stop the War coalition statement critical of NATO at the start of the invasion.
Yeah, I think they made a mistake doing that.
So they should be booted out.
No. Look, politics, you must say what you believe. Often you get it wrong. And the simple fact is that Putin is, he's a war criminal. His illegal invasion of Ukraine, he should be put on trial and he should be sent to prison.
Edwina, it's just interesting, isn't it, though, because it feels like Starmer wants to put this glossy new face on the party, but in reality, these problems haven't gone away.
No, I'd rather he leave the anti-NATO people, the Stop the War coalition, in the Labour Party, and then we can all have arguments and show them what fools they are and how foolish it would be for people in this country to vote in a Labour government. I'm much more worried about anti-Semitism. Ken Livingstone has spoken a tissue of horrible lies. He has no idea how offensive what he says is to people like my cousins and my family in London and Manchester and so on. The possibility of having a Labour government in 2019 really filled them with dread, with real fear. And they were leaving for Israel then, never mind in the 1930s under so-called Hitler Zionism. What a load of rubbish.
The Labour Party supported the creation of the State of Israel, has defended it through the last over 70 years, supported it in all its conflicts. And when I went on a tour of Israel in the 1980s, I loved it. I disagree with just one thing, the way the Israeli government has mistreated the Palestinians. But apart from that, I think someone said to me I had to spend the rest of my life living in the Middle East. The only place I want to go to would be Israel.
Final word to you, Edwina.
That's rubbish. You and your pals in Hamas really ought to be thinking very hard about all of this. It's offensive. It underestimates the good sense of most of the Muslim community in this country. And whenever you see prejudice, whenever you see any kind of racism, you should call it out right away, not when you're challenged.
That's the former Conservative Minister Edwina Currie and the former Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone.